All right, today we're jumping into a really fascinating legal case that all comes down to one single dramatic moment, the very last words of a dying man. So, picture this. A man has just been shot. With his very last breath, he names the person who did it. I mean, that feels like the most powerful evidence you could ever have, right? But, in a court of law, it's just not that simple. And that exact question is at the very heart of the case we're breaking down today. The case we're talking about is R versus Carty. A jury convicted Eric Carty of first-degree murder in the death of Kirk Vaughn Matthews. But Carty appealed, arguing that, hold on, there were two huge legal mistakes made during his trial. And that's really what our explainer today is all about. These two critical legal puzzles that the court had to piece together. First, should the victim's dying words even be allowed as evidence? And second, what does it actually mean when a suspect runs from the police? So let's dive in and break down how the court reasoned through each one. Okay, let's tackle puzzle number one, the dying words. So after being shot, the victim, Matthews, identified a man he knew as Sniper, who the prosecution argued was Eric Carty, as the shooter. The big problem here is that this kind of statement is a textbook example of what lawyers call hearsay. So what in the world is hearsay? Honestly, the best way to think of it is like that game of telephone you played as a kid. It's secondhand information. The witness isn't saying, here's what I saw. They're saying, here's what I heard someone else say. And courts are super skeptical of this because the person who originally said it isn't in the courtroom to be cross-examined. You can't judge their credibility. You can't see their demeanor. It all gets lost. And you can see the difference really clearly right here. Direct evidence is just that, direct. I saw the man run. I was there. Hearsay is one step removed. She told me she saw the man run. And that's exactly the issue with the victim's statement. Since he obviously couldn't testify in court, his words had to be repeated by someone else, which makes them hearsay. Okay, so if hearsay is usually banned from the courtroom, how on earth did the victim's words ever make it in front of the jury? Well, this is where the law gets really interesting, because of a special exception to the rule called a spontaneous statement. Right, the spontaneous statement exception. The whole idea behind it is actually pretty intuitive. It's that in certain incredibly high-stress moments, people don't have the time or the mental energy to make up a lie. The truth just blurts out. And the appeals court decided that this was exactly one of those moments. The court used a specific three-part test to figure this out. First, was there a startling event? Yeah, getting shot in the chest definitely qualifies. Second, was the person's mind still totally dominated by that event? The court believed it was. And third, because of that overwhelming shock and stress, was there any real chance to invent a story? The court concluded, nope, there wasn't. And this quote from the court really gets to the very heart of their reasoning. The trial judge found that the victim's mind was still dominated by the shooting. I mean, the man had just been shot. He couldn't feel his legs. The court was convinced he was so caught up in the horror of that moment that the possibility he was making up a lie was, in their words, remote. But hold on, because there's a fantastic counterargument. Around the same time he identified the shooter, the victim also told someone to get drugs out of his car. So the defense pounced on this, saying, wait a second, if he was thinking clearly enough to try and cover up his own illegal activity, then wasn't he also thinking clearly enough to lie and maybe frame an enemy? It's a really powerful point. So the appeal court's decision here came down to a legal principle called deference. See, an appeal court's job isn't to redo the whole trial. They're just looking for huge, obvious mistakes. They acknowledged the evidence about the drugs, but said the trial judge was the one who was actually there, who heard all the witnesses. And unless her finding was a palpable and overriding error, which is a very high bar to clear, they had to respect it. And they found no such error. So that solves the first puzzle. But there was still that second major issue for the appeal court to look at. And this one is all about what happened after the crime. The suspect, Eric Carty, finds out he's a wanted man, and he runs. And this gets to a classic courtroom dilemma. If someone runs from the police, does it mean they're guilty? Or could it just mean they're scared? The defense argued that the jury might have wrongly used the fact that Carty fled to decide he was guilty of first-degree murder instead of maybe a lesser crime. So how did the court untangle this one? They looked really closely at what evidence of a getaway can, and crucially, what it cannot, be used to prove. And a court drew a very clear line. They said fleeing can suggest identity. In other words, it makes it more likely you were the person involved in the incident. But what it cannot do is prove your level of guilt. And why is that? because you'd have the exact same reason to run if you were guilty of manslaughter as you would for first-degree murder. Either way, you're motivated to flee. And this is exactly why the second appeal failed. The appeal court looked back at the trial transcript and found 3 key things. First, the trial judge was very careful to only connect the evidence of flight to the question of who the shooter was. Second, she never mentioned his running away when she was talking about the killer's state of mind, whether it was planned and deliberate. And third, and this is a big one, Carty's own lawyer didn't object at the time, which suggested even they didn't see it as a problem.
So in the end, the court found no errors. The appeal was dismissed, and Eric Carty's conviction for first-degree murder stood. The court ruled that both the dying declaration and the evidence of his flight were handled correctly by the trial court.
And this leaves us with this final, really thought-provoking question. This entire case is a balancing act. On one side, you have these strict legal rules, like the ban on hearsay, that are designed to make sure trials are fair. And on the other, you have the raw, powerful search for the truth, like the last words of a dying man. Figuring out how to balance those two things is one of the greatest challenges our justice system faces.